A very good afternoon to you. Welcome on the Joy News channel. This is our first in our series of Thought Leadership series. Ghana is going through a major economic crisis. A buoyant economy pre-COVID-19 is now on its knees after having been hit by both external and internal shocks. For the 17th time, Ghana has turned to the International Monetary Fund for help. In its bid to fulfill the fund's conditionalities, the government introduced the Domestic Debt Exchange Program to bring debt to a sustainable level and boost the fiscal economy. As we speak, the Domestic Debt Exchange Program has been completed and it's time to proceed with the external debt restructuring. But how will the Debt Exchange Program impact confidence in the local financial sector, the economy, and the international capital markets? Secondly, is the IMF Ghana's only resort in terms of fiscal discipline, or can the nation do better going forward? Joy Business today presents its Thought Leadership Program series, one on the topic Debt Exchange and IMF Deal, a do or die affair. What do you think? We'll be seeking to analyze Ghana's economic crisis and proffer solutions that we hope will become a lasting one. My name is Benjamin Akakpo, here in the Joy News studio, and I will be co-hosting the show with my colleague, George Wiafe, who is in the Joy FM studio. He actually joins the conversation from the studios of 99.7 FM. But joining me here in the Joy News studio is Senyor Hosi, convener, Ghana Individual Bondholders Forum, and Mark Bedu Abwaji, CEO of the Ghana National Chamber of Commerce and Industry. On Zoom, we have former Finance Minister Seth Terkper. We'll also be joined by Dr. Richmond Etiahene, a banking consultant. But let's go over to the Joy FM studio now, where my colleague George Wiafe is standing by.
The studio's Joy 997 FM. I'm here with Dr. Ejapoma Jeke Dako. She is an accounts professor, lecturer at the University of Ghana Business School as well. And also David Tete, who is a consultant when it comes to the investment and financial space. As you earlier introduced, we'll be getting some answers from these experts when it comes to the Domestic Debt Exchange Program. Now, the government is set to have made some progress on the domestic bond holders. Is the IMF program the next option for us? And how do we get to the board and ensure that indeed we get a board approval for Ghana's economic program? The finance minister recently announced that they are going to engage our foreign bondholders or the external creditors with respect to all these other countries. Let's talk about China opting for a direct or bilateral engagement on our debts. But how do we get there, and how do we ensure that we made all the required conditions in terms of getting the fund program? What are the costs that this will come with in terms of meeting all the preconditions to get an IMF program? Dr. Ejapoma Jeke Dako is with me in the studio, and also David Tete. So let me first get preliminary thoughts from my guest in the studios of Joy 997. And then I'll get to my colleague in TV as well. So, I mean, Doc Ejapoma, we've made some, and I'm choosing my words carefully, as in supposed progress on this domestic debt exchange program. Your thoughts on how the process has been so far, and whether we could have gone another route, a more refined process to end on a good note, even if we really have ended this thing.
Thank you, George, and good afternoon to your listeners and your viewers. Personally, I think that the process has not been as smooth as it was supposed to be. I felt that the engagement wasn't as great. Engagement with our creditors, the domestic creditors, wasn't as great as it was supposed to be. A lot of the times people had to find out different things before the government would actually come in to either rebut what the people are saying or say something to confirm what other people are saying. Now, if you need to carry out a domestic debt exchange program, you have to make sure that all your creditors are highly involved in the process. They should own the process and buy into the process so that you be very, very successful. Coming to what I thought we could have done before even considering the domestic debt exchange program that we are seeing currently, I felt that government should have impressed on the IMF to have some sort of discussions with our bilateral and multilateral creditors, to see whether they can forgive some of our debts, because debt exchange in the way we know it is very painful to the ordinary person. So if we could get our bilateral and multilateral creditors to forgive some of our debts, the last time I checked, they made up about 40% of our external debt.
Yeah.
And so that, together with some sacrifices being done by the government, could have helped in a way. If that was not going to be very successful, I also thought that we could have worked to lengthen the maturities of the debts without necessarily having the haircut as we have it currently. That said, these two possibilities couldn't come on, and we are where we are now. We started on the 2nd of December, moved on to January, and then we ended up in February. If we had contacted or if we had engaged all our stakeholders, our creditors, very, very well, we wouldn't have had several extensions as we have seen. So that's my view.
And the final one was that window of opportunity. Yeah. Let me bring in David Tete. You have played in this investment space and all the rest. And for you, was the challenge or the straw that broke the camel's back that got a lot of bondholders agitated was the supposed 0% coupon payment that was supposed to be offered to bondholders? Because some are saying that if initially were offered about 10 or 15%, maybe we wouldn't have gotten here.
It's that and many more.
Yeah.
The whole announcement of the debt exchange was shrouded in some kind of mystery. There was an announcement before by the deputy minister about some terms that were expected after the reading of the budget. That was denounced. People said that wasn't true. And then an announcement the first week in December that these were the terms that had been put on the table. A lot of people were scrambling to understand what that meant. Is it that the coupons that I'm expecting this year are not going to come? The answer was yes. Apart from the fact that you are not getting any coupons for 2023, zero. You're only getting 5 in 2024, and your money is actually going to be spread over 15 years. Now, that was a shocker. I mean, for many people who have modeled their lifestyles around the coupon payments that they are expecting, because they have structured cash flows that are coming in, and they've modeled their lifestyles around these expectations. So that was a big shocker, where you wake up one day and you realize that an offer has been put on the table where you are not going to get any of the cash flows you expect. Secondly, we don't understand. I hear it's voluntary, but if it's voluntary and I don't take it up, what happens? There were no answers. So there were too many questions created when the first announcement was made, that there was more confusion in the market, than probably the advisors had anticipated. So everybody was scrambling for answers, and that caused the uproar.
The consultants that were brought on board, and we'll try to fast track to move forward to the current situation right now. Lazard, these are supposed to be international expertise and all the rest. Couldn't they appreciate the local market better and the structure or the form that this thing should be done to ensure that we minimize the opposition to such a program?
Well, clearly, the uproar that ensued and the noise and the confusion that ensued from the announcement showed that somebody had missed a boat and had completely either underrated or taken for granted, the community of investors that we had locally, right from the banks through the other financial institutions, through to the individual and retail bondholders. Somebody had missed a boat. And it's hard to imagine that nobody looked at models that had happened before, because Ghana is not the first country to go through a domestic debt exchange. We've seen it in Jamaica, which is quite close to maybe the size and nuances of our economy. You've seen it in Greece, in Europe. You've seen it in Argentina. And in all of these things, I think consultations were key. So if somebody was even somebody's an international advisor and would pick a blueprint, of something that had happened before, I think that the first thing they would pick is the consultation. So it may well be that they decided to ignore it and felt it wasn't necessary. But hey, it's for them to speak up and defend themselves. But clearly, somebody missed the point.
David, I'll come back to you very soon about the impact of this on the investment space. I mean, Doc Ejapoma, I've heard people put across several modeling, and depending on where you are picking the argument for, I get the sense that this domestic debt exchange program, after all, might not be that bad for the economy. And since you're an economist as well, maybe there'll be some immediate shocks. But in the medium term, it's good for the economy, looking at the struggles that we are going through. You look at our international reserves and the current position right now. If we're still meeting our debt obligations, I don't know what would happen to the economy. Freezing the interest payments, restructuring these debt. Today, Fitch actually downgraded our euro bonds and all this. Some will say that the market already is aware of it, because in December, government announced that they are not going to pay interest on these bonds. Let's look at this domestic debt exchange program, and governments claim that it has completed the domestic part of it, and the immediate impact of the economy. Is it really that bad? Apart from the shocks that bondholders might have to comprehend with.
Okay. So we can look at it in two ways. The benefits are that we are going to have to postpone some of the debt that we have to service for latter years. And that is obviously going to be giving us some fiscal space to carry out all the investments, let me say, both capital and recurrent expenditure that we need to be able to do as a country. Another benefit that we can speak about would also have to do with the fact that once we are able to go through this process and we get the approval, we would be able to get the $3 billion that we are actually looking for from the IMF to come and shore up our reserves and then solve quite a number of the issues that we have with credibility in the investment space, etc. So to that extent, when you look at it from that angle, there are positives to this debt, this whole domestic debt exchange program. Now, if you want to look at the negatives, obviously, like David said, people have planned their lives around this. Some have even taken loans against the coupons that they were expecting to receive. Some are paying their kids' school fees. I'm talking about the individuals. Some are paying their kids' school fees with the coupons that they hope to receive. Now they have like a coupon that is lower than how much they bargained for at the time they were making their investment decision. Clearly, this is reducing how much wealth the people are going to be having. So that's a cost to individuals. Banks who are highly exposed, like we all know, over here are also going to be experiencing some cost. If you look at the impact, you can think of the impact on the statement of their financial position. You can look at their incomes coming down, affecting their profitability. And then you can look more into the sort of things like job losses that may arise because banks would have had a bit of their capital going down. Yes, Bank of Ghana is going to be supporting the banks with 15 billion Ghana cedis liquidity. And that's it for liquidity, you know. Clients of banks can get their funds as and when they want to get, but what's going to be happening to the capital of the banks? Obviously, we are going to be seeing an erosion of the capital of the banks. So to this extent, I can say that people are going to have to struggle. Now, as to whether this is going to be beneficial to the entire economy, the debt exchange program is going to be beneficial to the entire economy, depends on whether we are going to be leading our lives like we led our lives before this debt exchange program. Are we going to be spending the way we spent, even as we are being granted some fiscal space in the meantime to be able to, you know, reorganize ourselves and revive our economy? What are we going to be using the excess funds that we are going to be getting out of this domestic debt exchange program in the meantime, because we are postponing the payment of our debt. What are we going to be using that for? Are we going to be carrying out our activities in the same way as we did? What's going to be happening to our revenue? Because we are here because of what has happened to our fiscal deficit over the years. We've never met our the target of the West African Monetary Zone, which is 3%. We've been doing since 1992.
Budget deficit, you know, and I look at other economies and they do surplus, and I ask myself, whoa.
Yes, how are they actually doing it? We've been doing an average of about 6.2%, right from 1992 up until this time. Are we going to be going on with the way we are spending, or we are going to be sitting down and then rationalizing our expenditure? George, let me just chip in this, because I hear people talk about burden sharing here. I hear the Honorable Minister of Finance speak about burden sharing here, but I see it more as a burden transfer and not burden sharing. What is government actually doing to support this whole debt sustainability thing?
David, I'll be coming back to you for you. Do you think that whether the page has really been closed, because there are still discussions about some special treatment for pension fund holders and all the rest? So can we say the domestic debt exchange program, when it comes to the local bond holders, the page has been closed, or it is a never say never thing? Let me now switch to, and this is the Joy Business Thought Leadership Program on Joy 997 FM and also on Joy News Channel on Multi TV. Benjamin Akapo is my colleague engaging our partners on TV. Benjamin, over to you, as we say, Jolate.
Thank you very much, George. And I'm joined here in the studio by Mark Bedu Abuaje. He is CEO for the GNCCI, the Ghana National Chamber of Commerce and Industry. We also have Senyo Hosi, who is a convener for the individual bondholders. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us.
A pleasure, mine.
We also have joining us virtually, we have Professor Peter Kwate, who is Director of ISA at the University of Ghana, the Institute for Statistical, Social and Economic Research at the University of Ghana. Septekbe is a former finance minister. We also have Dr. Richmond Etiahene, a banking consultant. All of them join the conversation via Zoom. A very good afternoon to you, gentlemen, as well.
Good afternoon.
I'll start with...
my base. Yeah.
Great to have you all on board. I'll start with Septekbe. Now, the DDEP, as we've come to know it, has come to an end. It's concluded. What do you make of the figures put out by government and the achieved target? Do you feel this was what we expected?
Well, thank you very much. Let me make two comments on these very points. First of all, I think it's welcome news that we have come, to some point, where we would be moving on. I had expected that the external was moving alongside the domestic, but it appears what is coming out is that we are now going to, tackle the external. In as much as, it is good news, I don't think we should be jumping ahead of ourselves the way we did, with the SLA, which was a conditional agreement, which was portrayed as though we were close to getting an IMF agreement. Remember that the domestic debt exchange and the external debt exchange are preconditions for the IMF African department completing the program, the draft agreement, before it goes to the board, which has also made it a precondition for the loan agreement. They passing the loan agreement. It's only the board that can do that. So if you like, you can take it to be step one. I also suspect strongly that we have other prior actions, typical of any IMF agreement. This is only one, probability of several, prior actions. And my hunch is that some of the measures that were announced in the budget, including the tax bills that are in Parliament now, are prior actions. I stand for correction, and I'll be surprised if I am wrong. So what that means is that once we have covered this first step, we now have to turn our attention to other prior actions which have not been published to date, which is likely tax expenditure. We know them, from going into an IMF, agreement. So whether we should have handled this, better or not, we have come to a major milestone. But I think we should probably, again, government should be a bit more transparent in telling us what is in the process so that we can be monitoring and not take, episodes along the way to raise a lot of expectation, only for it to be replaced, with an anxiety. Let me also comment briefly on, some of what was said by
So very briefly on that, the responses would have to be bite-sized so we can be able to cover quite a bit of issues to do with this. So yes, I'll let you go ahead, but very briefly on that.
Okay, just quickly. It's a debt exchange. It's not debt forgiveness. And we've moved from a developing to middle income. We were asked to join the debt suspension initiative, which we didn't. So I think we should come round to accepting as Ghanaians that we are now, albeit a lower middle income country. Yes, some bilaterals might decide to forgive some of our debt, but I think it's a posture that we have to manage our debt properly is what we need going into this IMF program, because we are not going to be treated like fragile state, because even many developing countries, if I may take that strict classification, are not getting debt forgiveness. At best, many of them got debt suspension, during the COVID era. So these are, points which I'd like to make. I think that we should be also facing realism as we go through this and focus on what is it that, we are going to do going into this IMF program. The debt exchange is calibrated to the DSA, the debt sustainability analysis.
Right.
And so if we are making changes, we should be cognizant of the fact that we are not disturbing that debt sustainability, which will be crucial for reaching an agreement. We may come back to some of these points again.
Right. Thank you for those initial comments. I'll come back to you shortly. Let me also take the initial comments of Professor Quartey, who has joined the conversation as well. For you, when you look at how this DDEP has been executed, and we've come to this point, some had to be exempted, crucial among them, the individual bondholders, the pensioners. What do you see, and could we have handled the situation better to forestall some of the impact?
Yes, good afternoon to your students, viewers. I think the debt exchange program is a bitter pill that we will have to swallow, unfortunately, because we are in a boat that is sinking. And what do? Do you jump out of the boat, or you help to steer the boat to safety before you start pointing accusing fingers at who caused it and all that? So that point has to be made. I also think that the process could have been handled a bit better, because if you look at the consultations and consensus building process, one, the timing was too short. Two, we didn't consult widely enough, and that led to a lot of the agitation that we saw. If we had done all the background consultation, including even undertaking some market survey or research, that would have informed us as to who to bring on board and who not to, and how much we'll be saving. And I'm sure the agitation that we see could have been minimized significantly. We all know that the financial market doesn't like noise. And therefore, when you're doing this, you ought to come out clearly without any hesitation and know exactly who you are targeting. Otherwise, if we leave the market with these kinds of noise, it might lead to some irrational or rational behavior, depending on how you put it. People will react because, for lack of information, they will react in a certain way. We've seen some panic withdrawals during the process. We have seen some kinds of movements and agitations and picketing and all that. So I believe that the process was not handled properly. It is something a bitter pill will have to bite as an IMF conditionality. There's no two ways about it. But there are, of course, the other things, fiscal discipline and some of the expenditure rationing, and then also restructuring our economy. These are all parts of the package that we ought to do. But we could have handled the debt exchange in a much more consensus building manner, in a much more transparent manner, and we could have achieved better results. But I must conclude that we've come a long way, and I'm quite impressed by how many people have, or how much we have even backed, how the proportion of people who sign on. Because initially, with all the agitations, I was very concerned, and I thought we might not even come this far. So it's good, but we shouldn't go out there and jubilate. We should work towards signing on to the program and getting macro stability, getting confidence
Right.
restored by economy.
So a bitter pill to swallow, but it is good that we've been able to come here to facilitate our securing an IMF program. Let me come into the studio now, briefly, gentlemen, Senyo and Mark, on the same subject. We've concluded the DDEP, at least from the standpoint of getting people on board to subscribe and all of that, about 85% subscription. But from where you sit, how the process was handled, everything about it, what's your initial take?
Well, I think it wasn't properly managed initially.
That seems to be the song that all of you are singing.
Yes, and I think that initially we all made a comment and informed them that it could have been done in a more proper way. Because it's actually a contractual agreement between the bondholders and the government. So if there's the need for you to change the structure of the contract, it's important and fair that you inform the other party ahead of time. And then tell them what are the disadvantages of what you are going to do and the advantages. And whatever their input is, they would have ahead of time also made you aware. If they are ready to come on board, they would have told you that for this, let's do it this way, and that will actually minimize the impact of what you are doing on us. And I think that that was improperly managed. And of course, the result was what you saw, where people were not happy and there had to be extension of these deadlines.
Started with Labour,
yes.
Other groups came in, then the pensioners finally.
Exactly. So I think we have other countries that have gone through this debt exchange and could have learned lessons from them. You just can't wake up one morning and say that the money that I have with you, you're not going to give it to me. I've planned my life around that money, both the capital and also the interest that will be coming out. People were using it to buy medicines, people were using it to pay their school fees, and even those who are investors, some of them are businesses that would want to reinvest some of these revenues from the debt to their businesses. So we just get up one day and say, no, we are not giving you that money. Definitely, whatever plans that they have would have been thrown out of the air, and they will respond. That is what we expect. It could have been done in a more better way than what they did.
Senyo, for you?
So I would not. What's been said is a given, but I think it's an awakening event for the elite in society.
The elite?
Yes, it's an awakening because they are the ones who are privileged with more information, with visibility, access, knowledge, and influence. And unfortunately, we have not structured that well to avoid this entire problem. We just left a program with Prof. Court, and I said what we have here is a trilogy of failure by the elite citizen who claims to be Ghanaian. Then you actually have the market failure. And then, of course, the arrowhead of this entire problem, government failure. We've had a whole banking sector equipped with all the skills and resources required. But the kind of banking that they did, their place in the advocacy of policy, would feed into a problem like this. All right, when we had maybe a few ones like Adongo, Isaac Adongo was really screaming about debt. Where was the bank? They were rather thinking of making money of government. They were not thinking about the sustainability of it. No single bank would define government as a company and lend to it, but they were lending.
So you're talking about the wide
There's
lending
a wide
to government.
yeah,
Because this was supposed to be risk-free.
No, you see,
and you're thinking of your shareholders.
my brother, that language, we all went to the
that.
same school. You understand? We went to the same school. I mean, even those who went to Harvard and Yale, we read the same books. And I was privileged to do my MBA finance, my first master's, to sit down with Harvard people and realize that they were not even taught anything much different. It is the other ecosystem that make them different. But here, those who even get to the ecosystem and those who don't get the ecosystem, we don't even find the value anywhere, anyhow you put it. What is risk-free? You must evaluate risk every day. That's why you have a risk desk.
Right.
That's why the banks have a risk desk and they charge us for it. So what did they do? When was the last time you actually saw the Association of Bankers issue a policy statement on government budget positioning? On government fiscal stance?
On their exposure.
On the exposure. What are they doing? They are rather thinking of taking advantage of it. Please, this matter.
So you're blaming the banks themselves for where we find ourselves?
I said there are 3 people involved. The elite Ghanaian, the markets, which that's where you find the banks, and definitely the politicians, that's where you have the government failure. We sit here, and when we were seeing the thing happening, we were not talking. We saw the borrowing going, we saw the fiscal recklessness going. Maybe I have to give credit to Isaac Adongo and to some extent the NDC talking. But you see, now when they are talking, you don't know whether they are really talking out of merit or just out of politics. But he's been proven right. What were we all doing? The banks were rather looking at taking advantage of the situation. The businessmen in Ghana were rather looking at how to be part of the rent-seeking feature of our governance frame. So we're all looking for opportunity because there's a little carrot there. And that's where we've all fooled ourselves into walking into and where we are today.
And now the carrot has turned to a stick.
It has come to yes, the carrot has turned to a stick. Look, sad as this may be, it's a wake-up call. There are advantages to what has happened. That the Ghanaian must rise up and change its attitude towards the issues of policy and governance. You can't be passive. We have a very docile, apathetic middle class or elite class. They think about themselves. They are selfish. We are selfish. When there's a problem with our education system, we take our children to private schools. When we have challenges with the public health system, we take our children, our own families, to the private healthcare, or we'll fly out.
Right.
You understand? Today, the chicken has come home to roost. So you cannot be passive about what's happening next door because you live in an ecosystem and you must be active in that process. You can't be just looking at what rent you can get, what contract you can get when the nonsense is going on, because that nonsense will outlive the politician that's sitting there. We are businessmen. We invest in the structure, in the real sector. We build businesses. And our investments are not meant for a one-term. Setekpa was my friend. And before him, I had friends. But he's left. I am sitting here. I'm a businessman. He's an analyst. He's an expert. And he's working elsewhere.
Is that to say you are no longer friends?
No, we are friends. We are very good. In fact, we are more friends now than because when he was in office, we used to fight a bit. But we had a lot of mutual respect for each other, I have to be honest. And same with Ken. But now that he's going to be out, he'll be out in 2025. He has to go back to his business. So when we don't build an ecosystem that makes us all sustainable,
right,
the chicken will come home to roost. So this thing there is a proper lesson.
Okay,
but the problem is whether we will learn it.
That's exactly what I was about to get to. Let me come to Setekwe on that very point. Let's take the conversation by the scruff of the neck. So we've executed the DDEP, and we're hoping that it will aid us get that IMF program. But what damage, how much harm is this going to do to the banking sector, for example, to people's investments? Only today I was reading of how in 2020, we all know how the banks struggled. 2022 was a very bad year for the banks. Actually, some of them, because of their exposure to government bonds and all of that, were not able to meet their targets, were not able to pay dividends to their shareholders. And it's been said that in 2023, it could be even worse. Just how bad could this DDEP bite, Mr. Tekwe? You would have to unmute.
Yeah, if you permit me just a minute. Can I tell my good friend I've not gone anywhere? I'm only doing, I'm a consultant, which is also a businessman. A businessman is not necessarily the only person.
He actually made mention of that.
Something.
I mean, when you go to the politics, you come back to business.
I'm doing consulting. I'm on a scholar visiting scholar program for only one semester. I have been in Ghana. I think he's aware that I have been sounding the alarm from 2017 when others were equally quiet and were also supporting government. From 2017, we had the financial engineering offsets, and I've been sounding this alarm on Joy FM and elsewhere. So I think that we should just focus on what is going on now.
Right.
Now, what we are seeing in respect to the banks is unfortunate. Remember that we had ESLA, which was going to be part of the solution to the banks. Our approach was a gradualist one. We started with VRA, debt restructuring. This is not the first time. And in terms of lessons, it's not just external. I think my friend knows very well that it took us from January, after the passage of ESLA in November, from January all the way to April, before we could negotiate a deal for the VRA debt with 11 banks who were meeting in my office at 5 p.m. every day. And we made an announcement in May that we had successfully restructured it. So we do have the entire 2015 bond that we did was also used to restructure the domestic bonds that we had taken to take care of Dumso and Single Spine. The entire amount, 1 billion. That is also another experience. So we do not lack, experience in Ghana in terms. It was lack of consultation. That was the bane. The point I'm making about this with hindsight is that, yes, we came and we said, let us, instead of going the gradualist approach, let's go the big bang approach. To date, many banks have sunk. And we should be careful what is going on with respect to the banks, because this is the second major hit that the banking sector is taking.
Do you suspect some of them will fold up? Do you suspect some of them will fold up?
I think the banks that are left are strong enough, they are big enough. And if they are going to fail, it is going to be the result of the fiscal, the way the fiscal was managed. Because remember, when you talk about the banks, it's not just the commercial banks. We now know that the central bank itself financed government, the entire deficit. Remember, the deficit was 37 billion. So it was, and beyond. So it means that the 44 billion went even beyond the deficit. That was the entire deficit, which meant if you take it that, other, loans were taken, refinancing, the excess of refinancing, then yes. And had the central bank not stepped in, would the commercial bank, is our market deep enough to support that budget? The economy will probably have collapsed.
Right.
So I think we should have this in perspective and make sure that this domestic debt exchange, is done with care so that it does not impair what is left of the banking sector. Luckily for it, the bonds are marketable. And depending on whether government performs or not, they will be relaunched on the domestic, stock exchange under book building and other programs that we had put in place. And I would hope that the key word is managing the IMF program well, in order that it can benefit the domestic economy, both banks, businesses, and industries. So this is what I have to say for now.
Thank you for that insight shared. Gentlemen, hold for me, Professor Quartey, Dr. Tiahene, and others, those joining me in the studio, Senyo and Mark. We'll cross over to Studio 997. George Wiafe is still there with Dr. Jackie Darko and David Tete. We'll take some of their thoughts and return here. George, over to you. David Tete. We'll take some of that.
Ben, thank you so much. And this is the Joy Business Thought Leadership program as you look at the domestic debt exchange program, the IMF deal, do or die. And I have with me here Dr. Japoma Jekedako. She is an accounts lecturer at the University of Ghana, Legon, and also David Tete. He's an investment consultant and analyst as well. So thank you, distinguished gentlemen. I wanted to look at or try and get some answer to this question about never again and whether we've learned our lessons going forward. David Tete, I mean, again, just a quick backtrack, quick wrap about how we got here and what happened to all the borrowers. Is it that the institutions were not working or everybody was in the comfort zone? At every point in time, there was a justification for some of these borrowings or what? Because I struggle. Yes, we are complaining about being borrowing too much, but for you, as an independent analyst, how did we get here?
George, I think we can spend a full day discussing.
Let's do about 2 minutes wrap on the how we got here.
Of how we got here. Look, we have been borrowing and borrowing ourselves out of our debts, which is not
where did
possible.
the borrowing go? Because if it went into certain investment, they should be paying for itself. Even if people consume the chop, it should impact on the GDP numbers. It should impact on people's livelihood. If I look at the GDP numbers, I don't see, if we even use the consumption approach, it's impacting on the numbers.
So it is quite clear. Usually to stimulate GDP growth, one of the tools you use is government expenditure. And you'd expect that the government can spend to kickstart growth in the economy. Now, that multiplier is very, very low in Ghana. Right? That multiplier is clearly very low. So government expenditure clearly has not gone into productive areas that has pushed our GDP. So that is quite clear. Now, if you look at in the last few years, our budgets, we have mainly been borrowing and using it to settle our debt, extending the yield curve, and borrowing, issuing bigger sums of Eurobonds just to settle debt. So we have not made significant investments into productive sectors in the country. So that is quite clear.
Doc, let me come to you. The bit about the never again. And I remember once I had an interview with the Larson and Danny with the banking sector and all the rest, and the bit about the never again question came up. For you as an economist, do you think that we have learned our lessons? Everybody has now been awakened. All the institutions are now being awakened to ensure that we wouldn't get here again.
Well, I think that people have now become more aware of the repercussions of their actions. I think that if you look at the financial space, the banks have now become very aware. Before banks, if you look at the income statement of banks, you would see that most of them were lending to government, and they were lending endlessly to government, to the extent that they were crowding out the private sector because they found the private sector to be more risky as compared to government. But we've now seen that government can also be risky. So I think that to that extent, the banks would have learnt by now. I think that individuals have also learnt their lessons. I'm hoping that government would have learnt as well. Because
but Doc, some will say that it's not about hope.
Yes.
Because when you have someone having about 80% of his investment being wiped, and I know someone who has had about 14 million Ghana cedis been hit, it is not about hoping again. It is about ensuring that we don't get here again, and it starts now. As in this argument about the self-government now and not the future.
Certainly. I mean, we should ensure that we don't, we voice out when we see government actually borrowing going on a borrowing spree, the way it has done over the last few years. We should question. We should be able to question. We were all sitting quietly, like Senior was saying, and then watching all of these things happen. Now it's come back to bite all of us. So I think, and the reason why I said hope is that I'm hoping because over the years, how many times haven't we gone to IMF? This is the 17th time that we are actually going to IMF. So I mean, if we don't learn this time, then I don't really know when else we are going to be learning. We need to rationalize our expenditure. We keep talking about this. It hasn't been taken seriously over the years. We need to sit back and prioritize, think about what is important. Think about the kind of expenditure that would expand our productive base, not the populist kind of expenditure that we've been doing over the years, the sort of expenditure that would win us votes. But the things that would help actually expand our productive base are the things that we should be thinking about. Because you see, borrowing in itself is not a very bad thing. It is what you use the money that you've borrowed for that is really, really important here. So what have we used the money for? Have we used the money to refinance our previous debt? Has it all been about recurrent expenditure? Have we not invested in capital? Have we not spent on capital? What have we done over the years that we've not managed to reap what we have actually put into the economy? Those are the things that we have to be thinking about as a country.
Prof, Doc, I'll be coming back to you about what are some of the things you want to see for you to be indeed optimistic or remain hopeful on the side of government. Some are saying that the minister recently in the engagement in Parliament talked about the restructuring of our fiscals and all the rest. Should we be eagerly looking forward to a mid-year budget review and getting into an election year? A real challenge. But David, I saw you shaking your head. It looks like for you, you are not that convinced about us learning our lessons and the never again and all the rest. But before you come in with your comment, you can also join us. This is the Joy Business Thought Leadership Program as you look at the domestic debt exchange program, the IMF economic program. Is it a do or die affair? What are the costs to the economy and even you and I? You can join in this discussion on our WhatsApp line that is 055 111 1997 with your contributions and thoughts about the never again and whether we have learned our lessons. David Tete, you're shaking your head.
Well, for now, no. I am not convinced that the lessons have... Look, there are three things, George. We are in a hole.
Oh,
so
how big is the hole?
Very, very big.
Okay.
If we weren't big, we wouldn't be cutting heads or hairs, right? We're in a hole. Because we are in the hole, we couldn't focus on how we got there because we need to get out of the hole first, right? So we are digging out of the hole. We're all being asked to sacrifice. So the biggest transfer of wealth from the private sector to the government is taking place to help us get out of the hole. But the next question would then be, how do we prevent ourselves from coming back into such a hole? Now, that should be the focus of all the institutions who have been hardly hit, all the banks, all the capital market players, all the private individuals who have been hit as a result of where we have arrived at in this economic crisis. How do we prevent ourselves from getting back here? In Jamaica, within 2 years, they were back. When we took a look at the budget as part of the work that we were doing, that budget, the 2023 budget, clearly showed it was expansionary and quite surprising for an economy in a crisis. Hopefully, we will get the chance to see it corrected when there's a half-year review. But don't forget that we made certain recommendations, fiscal adjustments that we felt were necessary at this time to be able to prevent us from coming back to this hole. Look, we have a debt to GDP target of 55% in 2028. By this program and getting an IMF program, we will create fiscal space for the next 2 years. Now, that fiscal space that's going to be created, what are we going to do with it? What questions are we asking, right? We should see that in the half-year report. I think we missed the point, and a major point in this process, because we didn't come together as creditors to the government, the banks, insurance companies, because that is where we could have got a deal. Exactly. And we didn't work together. We missed the point. We put it in our technical report, though, that we were recommending all of us coming together to form a creditors committee locally, and then we get some concessions from the government before we sign. But now, you get the sense around that the government has not put its best foot forward.
And I want to come back to you, David, as you wrap up, and I come to Doc, is that are you convinced that they say that when you see a child and the way he plays or she plays with a toy car, you can look forward to him becoming a good driver in future? And this literal translation of this local adage. Are you convinced the posturing of government is government walking the talk that gives you some confidence that the never again, yes, you are sure, or you still get the justification for all these things? Number of ministers, yes, some are saying that if you quantify that its impact on GDP or even cutting down, you don't get that sense. Why do you wait for mid-year budget before you take these measures?
You're right, George. I haven't seen any signal, any clear signal to show that the government is cutting, is reducing wastage in the system, is going after people who have embezzled government money. We haven't seen any signals. We are not cutting or reducing our MMDAs. Our budget that we are working with now is very expansionary, so we do not see the signal at all. And week after week since this DDP was launched, policy analysts, bankers, ex-bankers, consultants have all been talking about seeing the government committing, to making some cuts in expenditure, which would then send a signal to the rest of us that, look, leadership, which the government in leadership has taken the first step in this burden sharing. But for now, I don't see any conviction, right? We did a very elaborate work and presented to the minister. He conceded that this is something that the government must do and the country must commit to. But so far, the signals are not clear. Look, across the border in Cote d'Ivoire, we've seen what Ouattara has done. He cut down the ministers, right? That is probably the greatest optics you can send to the populace. Look, the president comes out and says, look, I've reduced this number of ministers, I've cut this, I've cut that. Everybody says, look, yes, action is being taken as a result of the fact that we're in a crisis. But for now, we are not seeing. And I think, on the other hand, some of my other speakers have said that, look, some of the elite people who have access and assets have been lax. I think, and I shudder, it's a fear I have, that when people start receiving their coupons, in the next 3 weeks and in the next 4 weeks, we could fall asleep again. Who is going to pay attention against the budget?
I'll be going to my colleagues on TV. And Doc, for you, some are saying that, again, election year, next year, another major challenge. But we've been in election under an IMF program before. Could it throw everything away? Because, hey, the government in power wants to be in power. Is that a major threat to the never again that we are worried about?
Sure, it is. Because if you look at the data from 1992 till date, you would see that even though our fiscal deficits have been way above what the West African Monetary Zone, which is the 3%, it's been way above that. About twice, generally. In election years, apart from 2004, you see that the average we've done is around 8.1%. So I don't see anything, I don't see that anything is going to be different next year, because if you track the data, you would see that every election year we overspend. So even when we had IMF on our necks, we still overspent. Wow. It was minimal, but we still overspent. So the same thing is going to be happening next year. It's a threat to all the prudence that we are trying to get as far as our fiscals are concerned. I think that, as David has mentioned, we need to see clear commitment from the side of the government. I thought that when some ministers resigned, the government was going to be using that as an opportunity to downsize the number of ministers we have. People say it's not going to make any difference, but you see, the difference is going to be making here is the signal is going to be sending to our investor community.
And give more meaning to the Boamenamembua.
Precisely. Right. So what is government giving off as we sit here? None of the flagship programs are being reviewed.
They claim that the World Bank is helping to review them, and then they'll come with a mid-year budget. That's
but that hasn't happened as I sit here. Downsizing of the number of ministers, we haven't seen anything. We are seeing replacements here and there. What is the government giving off? And that is why I said I hope that the government has learned its lessons, because as I sit here, I don't see any clear signals from the side of the government.
This is the Joy Business Thought Leadership Program as you look at the Domestic Debt Exchange Program. And this IMF deal that is supposed to give us some optimism about things turning around. Is it a do or die affair? This is the studios of Joy 997 FM with Dr. Ejapoma Jeke-Darko and David Tete. He's an investment analyst and a consultant as well. My name is George Jaffe, and Ben, this is what we have here in terms of the challenges and whether the hope against hope that things could be best for us. Over to you, Ben, in the studios of Joy News.
Thank you, George. Interesting point Dr. Jeke-Darko made about an electoral year and spending. I was just sharing with my discussants in the studio that at least in 2016, even under an IMF program, we're able to rein spending in. Is it something this administration can learn from and do a similar pirouette, if you like, in 2024? But let me come to you, Mark. So the cost of securing credit, it's become very costly. It's become difficult to secure on the back of the hikes in the monetary policy rate. What has been the impact of that? And tie that into the DDEP. How severe or mild has the impact of all of this been on the businesses under your umbrella, the GNCCI?
Well, I think it's been very severe.
Very severe?
Very extremely severe.
Break it down for us.
Because the private sector is highly exposed to government bonds. I mean, if you tell the banks and insurance are all private sector organizations. And you take a bank that has given acquired a bond for 9 billion and giving the private sector 4 billion. Definitely, if something should happen, then the bank is going to suffer. So most of the banks, in fact, the research that we did clearly indicated that about 50% of the total asset of the banks were invested in government bonds. And about 2/3 of their deposits were also within the government bonds. So we were highly exposed to the government bonds. Much as I would have loved for the banks to invest more in the private sector, I also blame the government for his high appetite for borrowing. In fact, we warned the government about the crowding out. When you keep
crowding out of the private sector?
Of the private sector. When you keep on increasing your policy rate, you keep on increasing the T-bill rate, a natural business person, for instance, like a bank, who would want to create value for shareholders, will be geared towards buying these government bonds. Already we were made, I mean, our economics book says that the government is risk-free. So instead of supposedly giving it to a risky business, they prefer to give the money to the risk-free government. And now the government is more riskier than the private sector. So it's also a wake-up call that you need to also be able to diversify and invest more into the productive sector. So the private sector is highly affected by this DDEP. The individual bondholders, most of them are business owners that have also invested in government bonds, seeking to get their capital and probably their coupons to reinvest into their businesses. The other institutions are also private sector businesses and holders. So by and large, we have suffered from this DDEP. Now, all the countries that have gone through the debt exchange, to a large extent, saw a decline in access to credit to the private sector. Prior to this, access to medium to long-term credit is a major issue. The banks prefer to give you the short-term, maximum 1 year, and the danger is that the private sector were also using this short-term facility to finance the long-term project, and paying it became difficult also for them. So with this, and given the level of exposure of these banks, it means their assets are going to be impaired. And the ability or the capacity of these banks also to lend to the businesses is also going to be affected.
You can't give what you don't have.
Yeah, you don't have it. So if I have invested in government bond, expecting that I'll get it in a year, then I have to wait for 5 years. And somebody is looking for money to invest in the agriculture sector, in the industrial sector, in the service sector. And if I'm a bank and I don't have it, there's no way I can give that money to the business that would want to invest. A mention is made of the stability fund. And I don't know how they are going to use that to support the private sector. I'm sure that basically for the banks to be able to meet their immediate demand for deposits and other things. And that will mean that they're also going to be constrained in terms of the finances that they have. So definitely access to credit in 2023 up to maybe the next 4 or 5 years is going to be difficult because the banks don't have the money.
Blunt question, are some of your businesses close to folding up? Do you suspect that some of them will have to fold up?
Yes, because prior to even this, the environment was such a harsh situation for businesses. And now people will now have to combine the issue of DDP with this harsh environment that they face in 2020, 2021, and then 2022. So some are on the brink of collapsing. But it's not so easy to wake up and say, I'm closing up my business, because people are depending on you.
Lives are tied.
Lives are tied to, you would want to keep the process going. You have a machine that is running, and closing that machine, probably bringing it back, will take you 3 or 4, 5 years. So what businesses are doing now is to ensure that at least they are sustainable over a given period of time. The challenges will be there, but we are hoping that we'll go around it. If you take Ghana, and the reason why it will be more difficult is that about 90% of businesses get their loans from the banks.
Right.
The stock market is let me put it, not so grown to the extent that people would want to go there and get equity. So they all go to the banks and get their loans. Now, with this, that they will not be able to go to the banks, a lot of them will be starved of funding to be pumped into their businesses. So the effect is that in the end, we are not going to get credit. Some who would have loved to expand will not be able to expand. It's only when they expand that they will be able to employ a lot of people. And definitely there will be job losses over this period that we are looking at. Difficult situation, but I think we need to work to ensure that...
We hope you'll be able to weather the storm. For you, Senor, some bonds matured and payments should have been made today. Are you aware whether these payments have been made?
Yesterday.
Yesterday, actually.
Yeah.
Have these payments been made?
They weren't made.
According to the promise of
so
the finance minister?
The minister's commitment is that after the settlement, so that's after today. Today, the settlement date. Yesterday, some bonds matured. They actually sent their corporate action payment file to all the industries. So that's what led to the miscommunication with me suggesting that the payments have been made, and I apologize for it. But they were not made because they were.
So they've not been made.
They've not been made. But it's after today. We want to see what happens by close of business today or first thing in the morning. The legal default comes in today for the payments that matured on the 6th of February. So that would actually largely wait to see. But you know, David made a point about government expenditure and then the multiplier effect. I don't know if you've seen that little meme that goes around where somebody gives money to somebody, I owe you, and then that $1 goes here, gives here, and then goes back to the person as if everybody's money is cleared. You've seen that one. That really tells you what that multiplier effect is. So it is about the productivity of the spend. So the borrowing has not been too much of a problem, but the productivity of the spend.
Right.
We have borrowed 171 billion in net borrowing under this government. And what we have seen next is that we spent about a third of it in capital expenditure, in which itself you'll find a lot of unproductive spending, and the rest for economic consumption. When Soitekpe was in office, he used to talk about smart borrowing. A lot of people were ridiculing him. Today, everybody can only look back and justify a lot of the things that he was saying. We must rise above the politics and look at the things in real sense and be objective, because at 4, we are educated analysts. And that's why I said the academic elite has really failed this country. All the decisions that were going on, when we're expanding SOEs from 86 to 177, we were quiet. People were rather looking for opportunities in those spaces. So this is a wake-up call. I think I've bashed that matter well enough. But we must just start taking active interest in how we reform. The DDEP is creating fiscal space, as Japan said. But to what end? If we are not taking advantage of this entire plot to properly turn around our economy, then we have wasted the crisis. As we sit, we are on the verge of wasting the crisis. The people that matter.
Because we are not learning the lessons we ought to.
Government, I mentioned 3 people who have failed here, right? The elite, the market, and government. Government has not shown signs that it has learned the lesson, because you're not seeing him take the fiscal actions that are required. When we went under the IMF, Soitekpe was then in office. He was quite adamant, and that's when we all started hearing the word consolidation. That's when a lot of people started hearing the word consolidation. But you could see that coming from the head of the financial sector, letting people know that, look, business will not be as usual. He got into trouble with a lot of his colleagues, and I don't think he's fully recovered from that. But he was doing what was professional and what was right. He said it, and you see some actions. He moved for us, and he was my biggest support when we're trying to fight the cancellation of petroleum subsidies. All right, he had to go against a lot of his colleagues in cabinet. So he was my partner in crime, if you want to say, as far as that particular matter. But it was a difficult decision. We are not seeing government today, after asking us to take the hit and private sector contributing to it, we are not seeing government take that action. Then we are actually still seeing the elite still sit back and be quiet. Right now, all that the elite are interested in is us getting our individual bonds and then our principal and coupons. What's next? Are we going to start holding government to account?
That's the bigger picture.
That's the bigger picture. For us to really make sense out of this, key things must happen. We must have proper structural reforms. One that drives a proper strategy towards economic recovery and development.
Right.
Nobody sitting in this group of panelists you have here can tell you what government's position on its economic reform and recovery plan is. Nobody knows. We are just sitting here hearing the everyday rhetoric. So that one already is a problem. Then two, the fiscal readjustment to create a leaner government. Not leaner government by appointees of government, but looking at government's expenditure and looking at the total public service size, using technology to minimize what has to be done, deploying private sector to actually deliver a lot more of our public services, so government can actually be efficient. The government doesn't need to borrow much. Right now we are borrowing at 30-something%, and that alone is another crisis that we are cooking. That's another Ponzi scheme that we are nurturing, and we are all sitting down and watching and investing in it.
It's still live on our Thought Leadership series, the first in this year. Let me move over to Seth Tekbe and find out from him. So, what should government expect on the negotiation table with the Chinese, since you once represented the country? It is said that our exposure to the Chinese is just about some 6-7 billion. In fact, our exposure in terms of external debt, I think they are our biggest debtor. What exactly, or our biggest creditor, so to speak, we are their debtor. What exactly can we expect from that angle?
Yes, thank you very much. And let me mention your acknowledgement of the fact that in 2016, in an election year, we actually achieved some pretty good numbers. I don't think we have time, but I could go over it if we have a little time. What we are seeing is usually the Chinese and sometimes the BRIC economies and the emerging economies diverge from the advanced countries and the multilateral and bilaterals, sometimes for political economy reasons. And so what it means is that the external debt negotiations that is taking place, they probably are not, at the table or are just observers at the table. Another interpretation is that you remember that, in the initial notice releases that the Ministry of Finance made, bilateral and multilateral facilities were excluded. Now, it did not prevent the governments from reaching out to these bilaterals and multilaterals. And indeed, we've heard that the IMF and the World Bank are helping with, a debt suspension initiative type, assistance to Ghana and a number of countries. So I would say it's simply part of the process. If they are observers, they would want definitely to engage. Yes, the reason our exposure to China has gone down, remember, much of the big debt that we use for the energy, the pipeline for Echuabo and others were linked to an escrow account in which we paid in the revenues from oil exports, some of which were lifted by Chinese companies at Brent price for purposes of, and so those debts are amortized, and that is the idea behind the sinking fund, that if you are going to borrow, you must pay, and so you are seeing the idea behind the sinking fund. That is why the exposure is low. If you would look at countries that did interest only, the exposure to China and the rest is much higher, to that. I think we should bear in mind the need for us to come to some agreement, in the context of these external debt exchange negotiations. Latest, maybe I would say it may not be feasible at the end of this month. It's impracticable, but if we can get it done at the end of March, at the latest, and then during the IMF World Bank spring meetings, get into the final negotiations, and nail the coffin on them, on the exchange with the staff level agreements, gaining acceptance, then I think we would be in a position within the first quarter, second quarter, beginning of second quarter, to have the IMF agreement going.
Right.
Let me sound another caution. We are not going to get
very briefly, we're a bit
1
pressed for
billion.
time. I'm sorry to push you, but we're a bit pressed for time. So very quickly on that point.
Just briefly. We are not going to get the entire 1 billion upfront, like the way we did the COVID loan. It's going to come in tranches, and it's going to come with reviews. And this is where it's important that our reviews is what will take us to the markets, back to the external markets. Our reviews is what would remove the overdependence on the domestic market. Coupons, if you look at Rich Fitch, we lost some, we missed some coupon payments in January and February. But I noticed that the T-bills were oversubscribed, and therefore, hopefully, some of that money could be used, to meet government's commitments, to the bondholders, and it would bring in inspire some confidence, in the system.
Right. Thank you so much. Just hold for us. We'll be taking your final comments, gentlemen, shortly. But let me bring in Professor Preeta Quartey, who also has been patiently waiting on the connection. I'd like to find out from you. Now we're done with the domestic debt exchange program. We're now moving to the external debt. Do you think that owing to what we've been able to achieve so far, we're going to be able to secure an IMF agreement, an IMF deal within this first quarter?
Let me quickly, thank you very much. Let me quickly touch on one issue Senor Hussey raised, and I would then come to this. Yes, the middle class have not been as active and vociferous as one would have expected, but I think they haven't been quiet. Academia has not been quiet.
That's true.
Honorable Tepe himself has not been quiet. He's been on radio, TV. I've been on shows with him. We've been discussing and cautioning government over the borrowing issue. Check 2014 IMF DSA report. The signals were there, the warnings were there. Check my inaugural lecture in 2017. That issue was highlighted. Look at the newspapers, the radios, stations, TV, even ISA's own publications, the State of Ghanaian Economy Report, their media reviews, budget reviews. We have highlighted this one thing, making noise. The other thing, if whoever is in charge will respond to all the issues we raise. But that is the beauty of democracy. What we haven't done as middle class or as academia is picketing or going on demonstration to get some of these things heeded to. But
I think the pensioner bondholders showed us the way.
They showed the way. Maybe the next step is for us to sometimes get on the show and make our voices heard. But having said that, yes, the external creditors would want to see some sacrifice from us. In the past, when it comes to debt relief and all that, we don't touch the domestic bondholders or domestic creditors. And it looks like the signal is that we don't hold our governments accountable enough. So they also think the domestic creditors should also suffer some losses. But having achieved that, I think the next step will be the external creditors. We're told that there is an external consultant, a French consultant who was doing the background work. It is my hope and belief that he's really achieved a lot by now. The IMF also has this framework that will bring all creditors on board, make sure they agree. We've also heard the finance minister will be going to China to engage bilaterally.
Right.
So it is my expectation that given all the goodwill that we have seen from the external side, we'll be able to sign on the external creditors will come to some consensus with government and give some debt relief and some rate scheduling if need be, so we can sign up to the program.
Right. To wrap for our end, so that George Wiafe can also wrap in Studio 997, I'll start with you, Mark. So I'm going to tailor your final comments in some 25 seconds. For you, how can we leverage this 17th IMF program to cushion industry and productivity in some 25 seconds?
Well, I think it's going to create some fiscal space, and we should use that to empower the private sector and the productive sector. Let us give them the resources that they need to invest in these sectors. Industrialization is the key. That's the only way out of some of the difficulties that we are going through, the only way to change the structure of the economy. So that fiscal space should not be abused. We abuse it, we'll go back to IMF.
There's no plan so to be abused.
When we use it to empower the private sector, and I think that more so with the one district, one factory. Can you imagine if the space we have created, we are saying that we are setting up factories to produce some of the things that we are importing. We'll be able to solve a lot of the challenges that we are facing.
For you, Senor, please stay on the point. I know you could, but
it's not as simple as going to give money to private sector. It doesn't work. Exim has done it. They've wasted money. Right. All right. They've wasted money. That's not what. It's not working. You must have a proper plan. Right. You have to have an economic strategy. Identify sectors you want to debottleneck the risk and make banking sector funding go and private sector investments flow into it. So there's a certain thorough strategic planning that has to be done. Okay. It hasn't been done. And if we have to do it, then this may just be the right time for us to do. Unfortunately, you haven't seen government do it. And you can't have it without proper consensus. All right. And I'll come back to what my colleagues on the other side have said. You need proper consensus and active planning for us to really get ourselves out of this. Otherwise, we'll share money again. Seth, just one feature. Just reiterated the fact that we've seen that not the rating, the fact that we have one of the most expansionary budgets that we have. So I want to use it at this point to call on Parliament, to call the minister back to Parliament to submit a new budget that reflects the DDE and the recovery plan for Ghana. All right. Satekwe, you've been in these shoes before. What are your expectations? In some 20 seconds, sir. Parting words.
My expectations, let me just repeat that this is a significant step. We do have other milestones to meet, including meeting other prior actions, and we must expedite action on these two fronts, the prior actions, of which both the domestic and external debt exchange, are a significant part, so that we can have the SLA, approved, and we go to the board, that the economy will stop the hemorrhage, which is going now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Tekwe. Prof. Korte, you have the final word in some 15 seconds if you can manage it.
Yes, I mean, certainly there's going to be savings from this. The interest payments that government is going to save should be channeled into the productive sectors. Just like we saw under HIPIC. Under HIPIC, some of these reliefs were channeled. There was a clear strategy, a clear plan to channel the savings into investment. So investment into the private sector, be it infrastructure that will facilitate the private sector activity, be it stable power supply, affordable utilities and many other things that will make the private sector flourish. Right. Otherwise, just dishing out money wouldn't solve the problem. Thank you.
Professor Peter Korte is with ISA, the University of Ghana. We've had Seth Tekwe, former Finance Minister, Mark Bedu-Abuaji, CEO of the GNCCI, Senyor Hosi, convener for the individual bondholders. I am Benjamin Akakwa. I've been coming your way from the Joy News studio, but we're still on the conversation from the end of Studio 997. George Riafe, over to you now. Conversation from the end of Studio 997. George Riafe, over to you now.
Ben, I'm here, George Riafe. Let's get to Professor, that is Dr. Japoma. Sorry, I keep on calling. On your last thoughts on this thing. Yeah.
Okay, so I just think that getting the IMF deal is going to be very important for us. We are going to be able to shore up our reserves because of the IMF deal. It's important that we put in all the necessary measures to get the deal so that the 3 billion can come in, investor confidence will be boosted, and hopefully all will be well. But as to whether we can sustain this will depend on what we use the fiscal space that we are getting in the interim for. If we use it to expand our productive base, then we are going to be having a sustained, kind of consolidation that we are looking for. Otherwise, we would come back to this point.
David, your thoughts on the IMF program, whether it can turn things around for us, and also the bit about market confidence, as you wrap up with your thoughts on this whole topic here.
Yes, it is an opportunity for our economy to be reset. When there is a crisis, we all learn from it, and hopefully we will become wiser from this crisis. And it's an opportunity for us to reset. The people who run the economy must take the lead in having us rally around a national plan. It's a good time to have that conversation. people who control credit or access to capital must now rethink allocating that capital only to the government, because we've now removed the government risk-free factor away. So we know that government is risky and they can mess up. So let's have a conversation about redirecting capital to more productive sectors of the economy. The people who are taking the capital must also be reset and use it wisely and productively in well-planned and well-thought-out sectors of the economy. So hopefully the IMF program will be the final reset in the IMF program, since we are all now called into action. So the national conversation must start about what is the direction, what are the sectors that we will deliberately promote as a country, and how we will fund those efficiently to turn around our country's story.
David Tete is an investment consultant, and Dr. Ejapoma Jeke-Darko, she is a lecturer at the University of Ghana, a business school and economics lecturer as well. Well, I know the debate will still go on in your offices and your homes with respect to this whole domestic debt exchange program and this IMF program that we're trying to close by the end of the first quarter of this year. I know, go on, let's discuss and see how we can get the best for our economy in terms of those whole challenges that we are facing as a country. My name is George Afe. I've been your host in studio here at Joy 997, and Benjamin Akapo was on Joy News. This is the Joy Business Thought Leadership Program, and expect more from us here at Joy Business.